In the last video, I talked about the difficulties in a democracy when, on the aggregate, most people don't really have the free time to research and learn more about every single candidate. But the reality is, even if you did have that time, it's still difficult to know what is going to be good for the country, what is good for the Philippines. So for these next few videos, perhaps, I'll be thinking about this more concretely by just looking carefully and trying to answer what is good for the Philippines. I think this is something that we all want to know and something we all try to engage with ourselves, but it gets a bit too difficult and we end up just listening to authorities. And I'm obviously not an authority on this, which is why I want to just think out loud, and hopefully it'll make you want to think about these things as well. What is good for the Philippines? It sounds like a very simple question, but in reality, the deeper you get into it, the more complicated it gets. So before we begin, I feel like before I begin talking about this, I want to first define these concepts. It's very important before we talk about anything to define the concept so that people will have a shared understanding of what we are saying. The concepts that you define end up becoming your preliminary assumptions. And it's important, that's why many people argue over things, because they actually don't have the same shared definitions. So we're going to have to clear this hurdle of defining these terms so that we can actually get to any kind of meaningful conclusion. So the first thing is, well, what is the good? How do you know what is good? This is a philosophical question, a very difficult one, and I'm going to sidestep it because it's a bit too complex to get into. So I'm going to replace the word good with the word beneficial. What is beneficial for the country? It's a slightly more precise word, and we kind of know what that means. Beneficial is a bit more specific than good. The second one is, what is the Philippines? Now, this one sounds like I'm a rhetorical question, but I quite mean it. How do you know? You need to know what is the Philippines before you can say what is good for the Philippines or what is beneficial for the Philippines. So I'm going to try to get into these things, and I'll probably not be able to get into all of it in this video, but we will see how far we can get. To understand what the Philippines is, one needs to know a little bit about Philippine history in order to know how the Philippines as a concept, as an idea, was first formulated, was first put together. This is something I think that should be an essential part of understanding one's history, is understanding how your country was created or formed or constructed, if you even want to call it that. Because every single country has no matter where you are in the world, the construction of your country is an essential part to your nationalism, to the sense of what their nation is. Every country has a different history of how it was constructed. I'd say the majority of countries in the past 60, 70 years that have been constructed came from post-colonial, they were once colonized by one of the major world powers, and then they got independence, and after independence, they established their borders, and they decided, okay, this is going to be our country. That is not exactly the case with the Philippines, because our borders were constructed even while we were colonized and not after colonization. And some other countries, say for example in Eastern Europe, came from the dissolution of a greater body of land mass. Say for example, before the Soviet Union was broken down into I think 11 different countries after it dissolved in 1989, 1990. And other countries, like say for example, Pakistan, India. India was one big country, and then when India was given independence, they split further into India and Pakistan because of religious divides, or East and West Pakistan. And every country has these kind of construction histories, and for the most part, it is very closely connected to their international relations with their neighbors. Usually, there's lots of problems in different borders of different countries because when they were constructing when they were drawing their borders, they had arguments over, well, which part is ours, which part is yours. And so up to today, there are many border disputes of countries wanting to expand slightly or push another country out of what they think is their land. So this is a big problem in the Middle East. This is a big problem in really most of the world where there's a land border. Now, the Philippines is a unique case because we don't have land borders. The Philippines is an archipelago. And Philippine history is a bit strange in the sense that it doesn't seem like the majority of the Philippines has ever really been a part of an empire or a broad empire, or if you look at it in the perspective of the Southeast Asia, they call it mandala polities. But the Philippines was never really a part of those things, or the islands that comprise the Philippines, apart from Sulu and some parts of Mindanao, were never really a part of bigger empires. Now, that makes it a bit, unique in the sense that the construction of our borders was 100%, was completely done by Spanish colonization. There was no sense of the Philippines fighting over which parts of their land are theirs, or anything like that. What the islands that comprise the Philippines, the earliest maps of what we call the Philippines today, came from Spanish colonization. And in fact, actually, if you look at Philippine history, it was not always the same. So at the very beginning of Spanish colonization in the 1560s, it only included maybe a small part of the country, that it kept expanding over the next several decades. So the notion of the Philippines was something that was continuously expanding during Spanish colonization, and by the time it reached the fullest extent of it, that in the same when it reached the map that we know today, it happened over a period of time, and it stayed that way, and it happened during the Spanish colonization. The Philippine people, the Filipinos, the people who lived in the Philippines, were never really united in a very nice way, or never really in a very cultural way, because of how different we were, how separate we were from the rest of each other. Again, if we were a part of an empire before the Spaniards came, then there would be a closer sense of resemblance with one another. But again, like even if you look at the Southeast Asian empires in Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Indonesia, the Majapahit Empire, Malaysia had some empires as well. Because we were never a part of that, we never had a time to actually feel like we've never had a part of our history where we shared culture with one another in a unified sense, as it may have been dictated by having a king, or a single king. We had small islands where there were kings in each island. If you read the writings of Pigafetta, who was with Magellan when they first arrived in the Philippines, they described there being a king of this island, a king of this island. This king is brothers with this king, and they're cousins with the other king, and they married into the family of the other king. So it was very much like there were many kings, and then they all had very small land masses, but it was never like the whole of Luzon was owned by one person. The whole of Visayas was under one unified culture king. And we know that this very much because of how many languages there are in the Philippines, how many ethnic tribes are in the Philippines, how many how much local culture there is in every single part of the Philippines. Just go from city to city, it'll be a quite different, slightly different history and culture. And because of this very complicated thing, where if we look at the way in which we were colonized by Spain, we were not actually unified culturally by Spain. They did not educate a lot of the Indios or the Filipinos or the locals, and most of the education really happened most of the education really happened within their borders, the small city borders, or like intermoors or something, and didn't really spread to the local population. So the average person who lived in, say, I don't know, Batanes probably didn't know what it was like for the people who lived in Sulu. And just as well, you can choose any other two ethnic groups. And so there was a lot of difference with each other, and we were never really united culturally, arguably all the way until American colonization and the Philippine Republic, or the establishment of the first, or this Second Philippine Republic, after the United States. After we were officially described as independent. So if we look at these things, we will see that there hasn't been anything that culturally tied the Philippines together. And so the only thing that really ties us together is our shared sense of history. And our shared sense of history came from certain people who decided on what everyone would study in our public educational system. So this is like people who are part of DepEd and things like this. The people who are in those positions of power are the ones who have decided what our national story is, what our creation story of a country is. It's not the same as any other country because we have a very unique situation. But they decided on our national history, which maybe you can say is usually pivoted by I'd say in my generation it's usually pivoted through the Katipunan in the 1890s, and perhaps even by people power in the 1980s. So, and that is like our sense of national history. And wherever you are in the country, you'll have slight variations on it. I imagine people in Ilocos learn a small, probably a different version of martial law than people in, say, Quezon City do. And maybe it might differ from school to school. But on the general, kind of very broad sense, our curriculums, we know like the Philippines has 7,000 islands. We all know about the Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao. We know who the president is. We know who the different presidents have been. And we know some things like maybe the national flower or national heroes. We have been given symbols in order to have a sense in which we are bound to each other. But apart from those symbols, apart from those facts of history, not much else really ties us together culturally. And the reality is that when we think about what it means to vote for what will be good for the Philippines, it's difficult to know, it's difficult to really generalize what is good for the entirety of the Philippines because of how we intuitively know that it's just very different from place to place. What may be good for me in Quezon City will probably be very different from someone in Davao or someone in Cebu or someone in Maguindanao or someone all the way up in, Ilocos Norte or something. And because of this inability to really have a very broad sense of what will be good for the whole country, it is much easier, it makes much more sense for us to think more locally. What will be good for my country, my kind of environment, my ethnic group, or my city? But this leads to a separate problem. Because it's quite difficult to know what is good for the entirety of the Philippines or what is beneficial for the entirety of the Philippines, because it's difficult to wrap one's head around what is good for all of the Filipinos, not just the OFW, not just the people in our cities, but in the OFWs and the people in native tribes. What makes it quite difficult is that because of this, it makes it quite difficult, and therefore we end up thinking more about what we see. Now, this is a problem, a slight problem, because if we don't push ourselves to think nationally, if we don't push ourselves to think about what would be good for the entirety of the people, we end up really only voting on what will help and be beneficial to us and will be beneficial to our people or to our groups. And this has been quite problematic historically in the Philippines' case, because the majority of the voting population, so the majority of people who are politically active, or the majority of people who are politically active because of population density, are people in the north, people in Manila. And therefore, Philippine colonial history or Philippine post-colonial history has been filled with a lot of politicians, a lot of people who have done things that primarily benefited the north as opposed to the rest of the country, because that's how it will be, right? If everyone who feels politically active will vote on who they think will best represent them, and most of the people who feel that way or who have the capacity to even vote and think about all this stuff live in the north, then there'll always be a disconnect in terms of the treatment of the north with the rest of the country. And this has been something that's been quite a problem in Philippine history that perhaps we haven't really spent enough time thinking about very concretely, which is that a lot of politics over the past 100 years has been very Manila-centric, and this has led to the feeling that for many people around the country that it doesn't really matter who they'll vote for, because they can never really win, because I'll vote for someone, but then all those people are just going to be serving Manila and not really serving us, and therefore we're only going to be stuck in the same problems. And a lot of these kind of issues in terms of Manila centricism in the Philippine history leads to something like, for example, the election of President Rodrigo Duterte, which is something we want to engage in more over these next few weeks, because it's very important to really get a better sense of why that happened, why Duterte became the president, and look at the perspectives of the people who did think and vote for him. And if I were to kind of put forth a simple or one of the many explanations, is that it is this sense of Manila centricism that has been a part of Philippine history and often relegated really, and not really put too much focus on. So growing up here in Luzon, I know definitely that I don't know that much about Mindanao, or I wasn't taught that much about Mindanao or Sulu, or the differences in colonial history between the people in the south versus the people in the north. A lot of it was not really taught, and therefore I have very limited sense. And with this system in place, this democracy in place, it'll always only serve people in the north, But obviously, that changed with the presidency of Duterte, and maybe that's something I'll get into next week.